I had always been proud of my little corner of the world, a modest, sunlit house with a neatly landscaped yard and a roof crowned by sleek solar panels. They weren't just a symbol of my commitment to sustainability, they were a statement of independence. While my neighbors complained about rising electricity bills, I enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of knowing my home ran on sunlight. But in a neighborhood governed by an overzealous homeowners association, independence was a crime. I'd heard whispers about petty disputes, fines over mailbox colors, and rules about unauthorized landscaping. I never thought they'd come for my solar panels. The notice arrived on a bright Monday morning, slipped under my door with that smug, impersonal efficiency HOAs excel at. It claimed my solar panels were not compliant with community aesthetics and demanded their removal within 10 days. There was no discussion, no compromise, just a thinly veiled threat dressed as bureaucracy. At first, I laughed. The audacity was almost impressive. Who spends their days policing rooftops? But the amusement quickly turned to irritation when I saw the fleet of HOA trucks rolling up my street the following afternoon, carrying ladders, tools, and the grim determination of people who genuinely believed they had the authority to control other people's homes. The foreman, clipboard in hand, approached with that same rehearsed authority that always precedes confrontation. "Sir, these panels need to come down immediately. We have orders," he said, glancing nervously at the other workers. I stepped onto my porch, leaning casually against the railing. Orders from who? The HOA board? Did they elect themselves sun police, too? My tone was light, but my eyes were sharp. He didn't respond, probably because he realized arguments with homeowners never go well, especially when the homeowner knows their rights. The workers hesitated, murmuring among themselves as they eyed the panels, unsure if this confrontation was routine or the beginning of something worse. As they set up ladders, I felt that familiar rush of irritation, the same one I'd felt when the HOA tried to dictate everything from fence height to the type of mulch I could use. It was petty. It was bureaucratic. It was absurd. And it was personal. I walked around the yard, surveying the panels. Each one gleamed in the afternoon sun, a silent testament to hours of labor and hundreds of dollars invested. These panels were mine. I had every right to keep them. The idea that a committee of self-appointed regulators could remove them on a whim was not just offensive, it was laughable. As the workers climbed the ladders, measuring and tapping the panels, I realized this wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA wanted to assert dominance, to show the neighborhood that rules, no matter how illogical, were absolute. And I wasn't about to let them win without a fight. I stepped back, hands on my hips, and let them finish their inspection. They didn't notice the small tools tucked away in my shed or the subtle modifications I'd made to the grid that powered my house. They didn't know that my solar panels were more than just a power source. They were a safeguard, a way to ensure I had control when others tried to take it away. The foreman scribbled notes on his clipboard and finally said, "We'll report this to the board." With that, the team packed up, leaving a tense silence in their wake. But the seed of mischief had already taken root in my mind. They had come thinking they could intimidate me, but they didn't realize that I was already planning my response. As I watched the HOA trucks disappear down the street, I smiled. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And when it came time to defend what was mine, I wasn't planning on playing by their rules. After the HOA workers left, I retreated to my workshop, a cluttered sanctuary filled with tools, wires, and a few DIY projects I had been tinkering with for years. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, hitting the solar panels I had mounted outside, and I allowed myself a quiet moment to appreciate their gleam. They had become more than a source of electricity. They were a symbol of independence, and the HOA's audacity had lit a fire inside me. I sat down at my workbench and began sketching the neighborhood's electrical grid. It wasn't overly complicated. Most of the houses, including mine, were connected through a series of shared transformers that fed the entire block. I knew from months of tinkering with my panels and understanding their connection points that there was a relay controlling power distribution to the street. If I could discreetly access it, I could create a disruption without causing permanent damage. Planning the payback wasn't about revenge. It was about teaching the HOA a lesson they would never forget. They had sent people to remove my panels, assuming I was powerless. They didn't know that knowledge was my weapon. I considered every variable: which switches I could safely flip, how to avoid collateral damage, and how to keep my own house running on solar energy during the disruption. I checked my tools: insulated gloves, voltage testers, a small inverter, and a few spare wires. Everything was in place. I even ran simulations in my mind, imagining the neighborhood plunging into temporary darkness while I remained unaffected, the irony of the situation not lost on me. There was a thrill in the anticipation, a quiet satisfaction in knowing I could outsmart an organization that thrived on intimidation. Humor crept in as I thought about the HOA board members, their smug faces, their self-importance. They were meticulous about minor rule violations, but utterly clueless about real-world consequences. This plan wasn't just about cutting power. It was about exposing their incompetence in the most dramatic, memorable way possible. Still, I had to be careful. One wrong move could lead to legal trouble, or worse, actual damage to the neighborhood's electrical system. I spent hours mapping connections, marking circuits, and double-checking my calculations. Each detail mattered, and patience became my ally. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment prank. It was a carefully orchestrated strategy. By evening, my plan had crystallized. I would access the main relay discreetly, create a temporary overload that tripped the circuits for the entire street, and let the HOA experience the chaos they had tried to impose on me. My own home, powered entirely by my solar array, would remain unaffected. I even imagined neighbors looking out their windows, bewildered, as streetlights flickered and electronics shut down unexpectedly. As I packed up my tools for the night, I reflected on the absurdity of the situation. A homeowners association, meant to preserve property values and harmony, was about to get a harsh lesson in humility. And it was all because they underestimated someone who knew how to think a few steps ahead. Before heading to bed, I made one last check of my plan, imagining every possible hiccup. Timing was crucial. I didn't want the HOA foreman to witness the disruption and trace it back to me. With everything in place, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. I wasn't angry. I was precise, deliberate, and ready. As the neighborhood lights began to flicker with the approaching dusk, I smiled to myself. The HOA might think they had authority, but they didn't understand one critical principle. When someone has control over their own resources and the skills to use them wisely, they are never truly powerless. And so, under the quiet of night, with the panels on my roof silently gathering the sun's energy from hours earlier, I prepared to take action. The lesson was about to begin, and the HOA had no idea what was coming. The morning was quiet, almost eerily so, as I stepped out onto my porch and surveyed the street. Birds chirped, sprinklers hummed, and the HOA trucks were conspicuously absent. Perfect timing. I grabbed my toolkit and slipped toward the small utility box I had been studying for weeks. It was tucked behind a hedge near the corner of the street, unassuming to anyone who didn't know what to look for. With a calm, practiced hand, I opened the box and traced the circuits to the relay controlling the neighborhood's power. Every wire, every switch, every connection I had memorized was exactly where I expected it. I double-checked my solar panel output. It was more than enough to keep my house running independently, even if the entire block went dark. A satisfied smirk crept across my face. The HOA thought they could intimidate me. Soon, they would see the results of underestimating someone who actually understood power. I flipped the first switch carefully, testing for response. Nothing yet good. Then I engaged the main relay override, diverting the flow of electricity to create a controlled overload. Instantly, the street lights flickered. A distant hum of appliances shutting down echoed from homes up the street. Within seconds, power was cut entirely to the HOA-controlled neighborhood, leaving houses in sudden, silent darkness. I stepped back, watching as chaos unfolded in real time. Sprinklers stopped mid-cycle, alarm clocks froze, and coffee machines that had been brewing for the morning shift clicked off abruptly. In the distance, a car alarm began wailing. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. The HOA, obsessed with rules and appearances, was now helpless against something as basic as electricity. From my porch, I observed the HOA foreman sprinting down the street, phone in hand, barking orders into the receiver. Their workers fumbled with their tools, unsure if the outage was a malfunction or sabotage. I imagined their faces turning red with frustration. All their confidence, their authority, their sense of control, it evaporated with the flip of a single switch. Neighbors began stepping outside, blinking against the sudden darkness. Some yelled at the HOA trucks, some tried to reset their own breakers, and a few suspiciously glanced in my direction. I remained composed, sipping a coffee I had brewed earlier on my solar-powered system, completely unaffected. The contrast between my calm and their panic was delicious. I took a moment to observe the subtle chaos. A man on the corner shook his fist at the sky, cursing the HOA. Two women argued over whose smart thermostat had failed first. Even the local delivery driver was stranded, scanning the street in confusion. The HOA's reputation as the neighborhood's moral authority was crumbling by the second. The execution of my plan was flawless because it wasn't about causing harm, it was about sending a message. I had avoided permanent damage, ensured my own house remained powered, and highlighted the absurdity of the HOA's overreach. Every flickering streetlight and stalled appliance was a silent testament to their arrogance. After 15 minutes, I restored power to the neighborhood in stages, leaving the HOA workers scrambling to piece together what had happened. By the time they traced the issue back to the relay box, the event had already passed, leaving only confusion, embarrassment, and a newfound respect for boundaries they had thought they could ignore. I watched as the foreman muttered under his breath, inspecting the circuits he had no idea how to manipulate. I smiled to myself. They had come to intimidate me, and in doing so, they had underestimated not just my technical knowledge, but my patience, strategy, and cleverness. The lesson was delivered without confrontation, without threats, just undeniable evidence that authority has limits, especially when it is abused. As I returned to my house, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about power, it was about asserting control, protecting what was mine, and reminding the HOA that intimidation only works when met with ignorance. I brewed another cup of coffee, leaned back on the porch, and watched the neighborhood return to normal, my solar panels silently soaking up the sunlight that had once again proved their worth. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with confusion and frustration. Word of the sudden blackout had spread like wildfire, and the HOA board was in full damage control mode. I watched from my porch as board members sprinted from house to house, muttering into their phones, trying to explain the inexplicable. Their carefully maintained air of authority had evaporated overnight, leaving only awkwardness, panic, and the unmistakable sting of humiliation. Neighbors complained loudly, some demanding explanations, others expressing outrage at the inconvenience. "Who cut the power?" a woman yelled from across the street. "The HOA is supposed to protect us." Another man grumbled, pacing back and forth with a flashlight in hand, trying to reset his own breaker. It was a symphony of chaos, and yet I remained untouched, my house powered entirely by my solar array. The irony was delicious. I noticed the foreman from the day before walking hurriedly down the street, sweat beading on his forehead, clipboard clutched tightly as if it could solve the crisis. He stopped at a neighbor's gate, talking fast and gesturing wildly, trying to explain the outage while avoiding any admission of oversight. I could almost hear the thought running through his mind. How could this happen? Little did he know, it had all been planned with precision. By mid-morning, the HOA attempted to regain some semblance of control, sending technicians to inspect the neighborhood grid. They scratched their heads, puzzled by the temporary relay manipulation. Nothing had been damaged permanently, but the message was clear. Their overreach had consequences. The boards, fines, and petty regulations that had once made them feel powerful suddenly felt trivial in the face of their failure. A few neighbors eventually caught wind of my solar setup and approached me, curious and impressed. "So you didn't lose power?" one asked, peering at my panels. "That's amazing. I've never seen anything like it." I smiled politely, acknowledging their curiosity without revealing too much. Some of them glanced back at the HOA trucks, now standing idle in the street, clearly humiliated. It was satisfying to see them wonder who had really been in control. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to restore confidence. They issued statements about unforeseen technical issues and promised stricter monitoring of the neighborhood grid, completely unaware that the disruption had been intentional and flawlessly executed. Their attempts to reclaim authority only reinforced the lesson I had delivered. Arrogance has limits, and misjudging others can have unexpected and embarrassing consequences. As the day progressed, life slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the blackout lingered in conversations and complaints. I kept my solar panels gleaming in the sunlight, a quiet testament to independence and preparedness. The HOA, once a symbol of unchecked control, now had a much-needed reminder of humility. For my part, I felt a deep satisfaction, not from chaos itself, but from knowing that reason, strategy, and foresight had won over bureaucracy and intimidation. There was a lesson in there for anyone paying attention. When authority is abused, cleverness and patience can restore balance in ways that brute force or anger never could. By evening, the neighborhood had settled into a tentative calm. I brewed a cup of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and watched as the last of the streetlights flickered back to life under the returning power. The HOA had survived, technically, but the shadow of their embarrassment lingered like a reminder to respect boundaries. And as the sun set behind my roof, glinting off the solar panels I had fought to protect, I felt a quiet sense of victory. They had underestimated me. They had thought rules and authority alone were enough to control me. But knowledge, preparation, and a bit of clever mischief had ensured that the lesson was learned, and that I would never again be anyone's pawn in petty displays of power. The neighborhood could move on, but I knew I had secured something far more important than electricity: respect, autonomy, and the satisfaction of knowing I had outsmarted those who sought to impose their will without reason. And that, I thought with a small smile, was worth more than any HOA notice or fine they could ever send.